Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you. You all know. Let's give this better. Carol's here, so she'll help. Is this better? Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to everybody who's attending on Zoom. As you know, tonight we have the privilege of hosting Nina Berman and David Butow. They're going to talk about the challenges of covering events in a contemporary America and give us some context of the arc of their careers and their coverage.
Just as a quick introduction to our guest tonight, Nina Berman is a documentary photographer, filmmaker, author, and educator. Her wide-ranging work focuses on American politics, militarism, post-violence trauma, and resistance. Her photographs and videos have been exhibited at more than 100 venues, from the walls of the Za'atari refugee camp to the Whitney Museum of American Art. She is the author of Purple Hearts, Back from Iraq, Portraits and Interviews with Wounded American Veterans, Homeland, an examination of the militarization of American life post-September 11th, and an autobiography of Miss Wish, a story told with a survivor of sexual violence. She is a professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where she directs the photography program. Nina photographed at the Capitol on January 6, 2001. Recently, Nina created the short film Living Under Warplanes, documenting the hostile sonic environment that the U.S. military training is creating in civilian communities across America. And she has been photographing protests in the aftermath of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade. Her work is in many important museum collections, including the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and the Museum of Fine Arts at Houston. So it's a true honor for us to welcome Nina tonight.
And I'd like to introduce you all more thoroughly to David Butow. David Butow is a freelance photojournalist whose projects and assignments have taken him to over 24 countries. Born in New York and having attended college at University of Texas at Austin, he then moved to Los Angeles and worked in newspapers before beginning a freelance career for magazines in the 1990s. From the mid-90s through the late 2000s, he worked as a contract photographer for U.S. News and World Report magazine, covering social issues and news events such as post 9/11 New York, the Palestinian-Israeli Intifada, the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, the 2019 Hong Kong protests, and the funeral of Nelson Mandela. His new book, Brink, which we have up front, I encourage everyone to take a look at, chronicles politics in the United States from the 2016 presidential election through the chaos of the Trump presidency, the turmoil of 2020, and concludes with the insurrection and its aftermath at the US Capitol in January of 2021. Most recently, his photographs, which he will share with us tonight, are from Ukraine and Uvalde, Texas, and have appeared in Politico, Time, and the New York Times. Please welcome David Butow.
Just one last note for our viewers on Zoom. We will try to have a brief discussion and question and answer towards the end. So if you would like to submit questions, please use the chat feature. With that, we'll get started, and thank you again.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, louder, better. Okay, first, I want to thank Sid and Michelle Monroe for hosting this, for creating this amazing gallery, and for supporting photojournalists for so many years. And I want to thank David Butow for being here with me today, and you all for coming. I thought I'm just going to show one picture and a short video tonight, and I hope it inspires some reflection, thoughts, and questions for the Q&A after. So I'm going to read from some notes. Forgive me. I just want to make sure I touch on all the points. So white supremacist movements are not new in the US. It's a foundational story of our nation. David and I and many journalists over the years have seen various manifestations of this, but things are very different now than even 10, 20, or 30 years when I first started making pictures. To illustrate the change from then and now, I thought it'd be interesting to reimagine a past moment and explain how that moment would play out today. So this is a picture I made in 1990 in a small town in southern New Jersey. A faction of the Ku Klux Klan based in New Jersey and Pennsylvania tried to rally at a baseball field, and hundreds of people, black and white, including many high school students, showed up to let them know they were not welcome. Today, the scene would be very different. One, the Ku Klux Klan would be wearing Proud Boy shirts. They would be waving Patriot Front or American First flags. They would likely be masked up to hide their identity and give them a sinister look, with a skull face or some Punisher logo, or maybe American flags as masks. They might also be wearing Oath Keeper or 3%er shirts, maybe with blue line pro-police patches and pro-gun threatening slogans like "come and take it." Amongst them would be QAnon cultists. If this was many of the open carry states, they would be armed. They would also be wearing body cams, GoPros on their chests and their heads, and they would be live streaming and filming you, members of the press. The anti-racist, pro-democracy folks, like the young man who stood up to them, would likely never have made it to the fence, because he would have been pushed back several feet by lines of heavily armed police with both lethal and chemical weapons in full riot gear. Some of them would likely have their name patches or ID numbers taped off so they could not be identified. They would be poised to arrest and or attack, but not the Klansmen who may have had a permit to march, but the people that came to express their horror and anti-racist solidarity. Only one time in my life, and I've been to countless numbers of these demonstrations, have I seen police arrest right-wing forces, and that was in Washington, D.C. in December 2020, when the Proud Boys rampaged across D.C. as a dress rehearsal to January 6th. But back to this picture. Stationed nearby would be police reinforcements, maybe in armored military vehicles, which might include state police or even Department of Homeland Security. All of this paid for by the local and state and federal taxpayer. The police would be filming everything, including you, the press. The anti-racists, which we now call maybe Antifa or Black Lives Matter, or local folks who understand that it is a threat when fascists and white supremacists are allowed to assemble unopposed. They may also be masked. They're also filming and live streaming. They can be as suspicious of journalists as the right-wing forces are. Everyone is afraid to be seen, and everyone is filming everything. The only question is when and what will spark the confrontation, because that is the point of the event. Conflict is by design. It is not an accident. And this is important to understand. For the event to have meaning, it must go viral. And that means there must be confrontation, humiliation, and actual violence or threats of violence. This increases audience engagement in the live stream, in the tweets, in the retweets, which increases revenue, influence, followers. Violence in this context can be a career maker. So in this mix are people like me and David and others just trying to document the moment. We are being pushed, maybe yelled at, filmed, questioned. If we are smart, we will not wear our press credentials with our names and pictures visible for fear of being doxxed, stalked, or harassed. In 1990, local newspapers might have reported that an overwhelming number of residents showed up to drive the Ku Klux Klan out of town, and everyone would have read that story. Today, there would be no local newspaper to report on this because local journalism has largely been decimated, although there is some attempt to turn this around. The story rather would have been told across parallel media universes. The Ku Klux Klan of today would have their own channels. The anti-racists would have their own channels. This is a kind of grotesque reality, but it is a perfect landscape for fascism and violent dictatorship to grow. All of this was ramped up with the Trump candidacy and presidency, when he specifically called the press the fake news and the enemy of the people. And when he meant the press, he didn't mean the right-wing press. He meant, he didn't mean Fox and One American News and Breitbart. He meant legacy media who still believes that holding power to account is the basis for good journalism. So with that, I thought I would take you inside a Trump rally, 2018 in Fort Myers, Florida. And you can see the kind of the setup where the press is centered in the middle of the arena, like a kind of zoo cage, and what his followers did to Jim Acosta, the CNN newscaster. It's only a minute, 20 seconds long. Yeah. I thought I would pass it to David unless we want to have questions now. Michelle, what would you like to do? Okay.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'd like to. I was just planning to shout, but this is probably much better. Thank you very much, Nina. Let's everybody give. I have to say that, Nina and I have known each other for maybe 20-ish years or something. And, she's really dedicated her career to these kinds of issues, to some of the most challenging things to photograph. And she's always done it in a very insightful and nuanced and powerful way. And, I really appreciate the work that she's done over the years. And I really want to thank very much Sid and Michelle Monroe for inviting me here today to get a chance to speak with you and share the work, and really more broadly for everything that they do for the profession of photojournalism and the kind of focus on integrity and seriousness and sense of history that they bring to the photography world and to the art world. And it makes a huge impact on our profession to have the two of them doing this kind of work and having this kind of space devoted to photojournalism. So let's give them a round of applause. And especially since they're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the gallery, I think it's fantastic. So thank you again. So, you know, the dynamics that Nina was describing, the kind of changes that she's seen since the 90s. I mean, I very much echo that. I mean, I think one of the most distinctive things that I've noticed is a sense of the sort of balkanization of the media. So if you think back, let's say 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, really before there were several different cable news networks, you had CNN, but really you had the 3 television networks, and people tended to sit down and actually watch the local news. This is, of course, all pre-internet, right? So that was just the way that a lot of people around the country got their national and international news, was from these network broadcasts, which tended to be more or less you know, centric, let's say, or sort of centered politically. I mean, there was a little bit of variation. But it wasn't like wild swings like you see today, you know. And then also the dynamic that Nina mentioned about local newspapers, and so there was a tremendous consolidation. I mean, probably starting in the 80s, but it really picked up steam in the 1990s and into 2000s, where there were a lot of local newspapers, some large, some small, some. You know, even big newspapers like the Los Angeles Times, for example, that were family owned, but then they became owned by large corporations. And those corporations had a board that they were responsible to. And sometimes they were, you know, it was publicly traded companies. And, you know, the profit, the bottom line became the most driving force of what was happening at those newspapers. And in some cases, I'm from LA, and so I'm using that as an example. That family, you know, which had owned the Times for about 100 years, sold the paper to a large company. And, you know, as a result, the size of the news staffs were shrunk significantly. Papers like, sort of like, you know, let's say large city newspapers, but not the largest like the New York Times, but let's say the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, maybe the Miami Herald, papers of that size often had bureaus all around the world. And they might have a reporter in these different regions, you know, around the world. And that, you know, when budgets got cut, when the, you know, the internet advertising models started to become more dominant, a lot of those positions were lost, and it's taken a serious hit on journalism for the sort of independent voices and the kind of variety you get from so many different reporters being able to, you know, to focus on their own regions and their own cities. And that just doesn't exist the same way today. So, I mean, and to some, you know, what's replaced that is, I think, you know, sort of a diffusion of the media landscape. Some of it's good. There's more, it's become, in a sense, sort of more democratic. It's allowed people who, you know, are interested in journalism, but maybe don't have the backing of a large media organization. They're able to get their stuff on the web. They can get followings, you know, on Twitter, you know, but you can imagine that also tends to highlight the most extreme voices and people who are just trying to use that to get attention. So it's a very different landscape. I think the newspapers and television and websites now, instead of being seen as sort of a collective journalistic experience for viewers or for readers, are now affiliated with political parties or points of view. it ranges from Fox to, let's say, MSNBC, just mainstream cable news networks, right? If you want to call Fox a news network, it's not, I wouldn't really call it that, but in any case, and then you have all these different websites that are very popular, and they're each associated. They tend to be associated with a certain political point of view. So one of the things I've noticed, and you've probably noticed this too, is that when you go out to cover these protests, no matter who's, which side or who's doing the protest, there's a lot of suspicion about, if you're carrying a camera or if you're working as a journalist. I think the people who are doing these demonstrations, like their idea is, it's not like, oh, this is an independent journalist, but you're either with us or you're against us. And so that makes it harder to work, because ideally in these kind of situations, you just want to go out and work without really interfering with what's happening. And you don't want the crowd to be reacting to you, because that's changing the dynamic of the situation. And you're not there to report on how they're reacting to the media. You just want to cover what it is that they're trying to say and communicate. And then two, or B, whatever I said, letters or numbers, it becomes, it's just more difficult to get, sort of what I would call true and honest, spontaneous photographs or interviews in these situations. And it's not to say that you can't do it, but it just requires, for me anyway, my personal experience is that it just requires a lot more effort. That's like the first thing I'm thinking about when I go out, whether it's a Trump rally or let's say 2020, for example. I was living in Washington, D.C., and there were a lot of, that summer, it was the summer of COVID, and then you had the George Floyd murder. So there were a lot of BLM protests. Then later in the year, there were Trump protests. And the first thing I'm thinking about when I go out to do this is, what's the tone of the crowd going to be? And, you're always sort of aware of people around you and how they're going to be reacting to you. So speaking of Washington, D.C., I'm going to show three very short sets of photographs. The first is political photography that I started in 2015-16 during the presidential election. I was very interested in why Donald Trump was gaining so much traction, and I began photographing, with the expectation that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. But I was really curious about sort of the reasons for Trump support. So I went out to the Midwest and covered a lot of campaign rallies, and then did some other photographs like this in a motel room in Michigan, which is, one of the swing states. And I was trying to get a sense of sort of what the culture in these places was at the time, and hope that would illuminate, in a sense, what some of Trump's support was. And then when, I was joking to a lot of my friends who were kind of nervous about the possible outcome of the election. And I said, look, Trump's not going to win, but if he does, I'll move to Washington to get a front row seat to the apocalypse. Ha ha. And, so I sort of had to do it. That's what I said I was going to do. I didn't really think I was going to have to do it, but I did end up moving to DC in 2017. Here's just a couple more pictures from the Midwest. So this is a spread, by the way. The first few pictures are spreads from my book Brink, but you have a dilapidated factory in the Midwest on the left, and then contrasted with a startup in San Francisco. And then, so 2017, I moved to Washington, and I started working at the Capitol and the White House, working for different media organizations, sometimes on assignment. A lot of times I was just working independently and funneling the pictures to my agency Redux. And a lot of that was sort of the machinations of government. There were 2 impeachment trials. There was, there were the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination, which brought up, multiple issues, primarily sort of gender issues and power things. And then there was 2020. So the picture on the left is from Lafayette Square, which is right across the street from the White House. That's, a line of police against Black Lives Matter demonstrators who were pictured on the right. This was from the Kavanaugh hearings. This is Senator Jeff Flake, who was really the only Republican to go against his party, at least initially, and call after the allegations of sexual misconduct came out. He called for a delay, a 1-week delay. So this picture was from the Senate Judiciary hearing where he took his own colleagues, other fellow Republicans, by surprise by calling for this delay. And this was just immediately after the gavel came down and they surrounded him. Lindsey Graham, I'm pretty sure he said this. Actually, I asked Flake about this a few months ago. Lindsey Graham sat down and said, "Son, we got to talk." And then, of course, all this led up to the 6th of January in 2021. And that event was the third Trump rally after the election. So like Nina mentioned, there was sort of like there was a rally in November and then there was one in December. And those were to generate enthusiasm. And they also served almost, I think, as like practice for what they were going to do on the 6th of January, which is the day, the votes were getting certified in Congress. One last picture from January 6th. All right, so more recently then, I'll show just 2 quick bodies of work. This is from Uvalde, Texas. And, I was in LA when I heard about that shooting, and I was really, I was trying to distance myself in a way from covering these really heavy stories. But when that happened, I grew up in Texas, and something about that, maybe that connection, it just made me very angry and very sad. And I was very discouraged by what had happened, what's been happening with the leadership in the Texas government, their governor, their attorney general, the lieutenant governor. I just thought they were really extreme, and they'd been promoting this very like pro-gun policy. And I had been in South Texas about a year before doing a story at the border. And I'll just tell you a quick anecdote, but I was outside of my hotel and a guy was walking into the hotel, kind of a youngish guy, and he had on a t-shirt that had an AR-15 and it said, I oil my gun with the tears of liberals. And I was just, I flipped the guy off. And then, and then we ended up getting into a short, not impolite conversation about free speech and whatnot. And then he went inside and the whole thing was over. But, I thought about that after Uvalde, and I decided I wanted to go. I just, I had been to Columbine. I had to look it up, but that was in 1999. I went to Columbine the day of the shooting. I flew from California to Colorado and covered that tragedy. And when I was looking at these news stories, I realized that I had been to a school shooting in Springfield, Oregon, the year before Columbine. I'd forgotten all about it, but I saw one of my pictures online, and the whole thing just was so maddening that this is continuing to happen. And the idea that in Springfield, I think there were 2 or 3 high school students that were killed. And here we are, in order for this to make national news, it just keeps getting ratcheted up. So I was very interested in not just the aftermath, not covering the shooting for its own sake, but really covering the aftermath of a shooting and what that meant. Because in a sense, and Nina had a very good point about this, I think, put something on Twitter several days after this happened, just raising the question of what kind of a difference would it make if us, just the general public, were seeing photographs of these children after a shooting like that. And I've thought about it. I don't have a conclusion about that, but essentially what we're seeing as TV viewers, as people who are seeing these events online, is we're seeing just the aftermath of something like this. And there's the balloons and there's the stuffed animals. And that's just people on the scene, just ordinary citizens who are trying to, they're trying to commemorate the lives of these children, which is a very positive thing, but it does something of somehow beautifying this absolutely horrific situation. So I just think that, it's important to ask that question. And as I think, the idea of this is, thoughts and prayers, right? And it just, we're not really seeing in a visceral way what these events are actually about. The next set, it's just 5 photographs. It's from Ukraine. When the Ukraine war started, I wasn't really planning to, I wasn't really interested in going and being a war photographer, again, or whatever, but there were so many possibilities in the first week or two of, as it was unfolding, not knowing what could possibly happen, right? All these directions that it could go in. So I decided to go to Europe and just at least place myself in the theater close by if something happened. And I ended up getting an assignment for Politico on refugees. So I was able to spend several days working on that. So this is, these are refugees who've come across by foot. And this is just inside the Polish border. They're waiting for a bus ride to get to the next place, where there are volunteers like these people who are going to help them find at least some temporary shelter, give them some ideas about how to get trains to other parts of Poland and other parts of Europe. So it was a fascinating story to work on. I mean, obviously very sad, but the upside was, I did see just the sense of sort of broad European community and humanity on the part of the Poles in particular. There were professionals and there were volunteers from Poland and then from all over Europe who came out to help these refugees as they were arriving. And this is from the train station in Lviv, which was sort of a hub of refugee movement from different parts of Ukraine, kind of getting funneled mostly into Poland. Mostly women and children, because the men from the ages of 18 to 65 weren't supposed to be leaving. They weren't allowed to leave unless they had a good reason to. So this was a happy situation. This was a woman with 3 children. One of the children's not in this photo. She's from Eastern Ukraine. Her house was bombed. Her husband stayed, but she was able to get her 3 kids out of the country, and she got to kind of a refugee center right across the border in Poland, and a Polish family happened to meet her right then at that moment, and they said, "Come and stay with us." And it was just very obviously very, there's some heartwarming conclusions, or at least in the short term, to some of these situations. And then this picture is the last one I'll show, which is from the train station in Lviv again, a woman and her son getting a train to Poland. So those are all my photographs, and now I guess we could open it up. Yeah. So I'm going to take this microphone out to the audience. Switch is off. This good. Actually, I have a question for Nina.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm very interested, Nina. I always thought your work always seems to be about something, and it seems to have there's a strong point of view. And I'm curious if, when you started out in photography, if that was a big motivator, or if that kind of emerged from your budding work as a photographer.
Oh, wow. I have to find a way to answer that question. I think I was, I treated the United States a little bit like I was a foreigner. I think, having spent most of my life in New York City, I saw the rest of the country as kind of unknown territory. And so I saw, the rest of the United States from this almost like anthropological point of view, like, oh, look at these interesting natives here. And I mean, I don't mean to sound arrogant or idiotic, but it was new and it was different, and I truly wanted to understand. And one of the things that I feel really sad about this political moment is that I used to photograph really far out super right-wing people. And I would always find a way to find a point of connection because I wanted to really understand, beyond the events, beyond the rallies, like what makes them think, what makes them, why do they distrust the government? Well, I kind of distrust the government. So like, can we have a conversation? And I don't think I could have that experience today. And I don't know if it's something in me that's changed or if it's something in the political landscape, and that doesn't really answer your question, but what I'm trying to say is I did go out with this idea of, I need to understand what it is I'm seeing, as opposed to, I have this idea and I'm going to find something to affirm my idea, right? And there is a difference.
This particular environment, with the elements that you detail, is so right for fascism. And can you give us some kind of historical context? I mean, what makes you know that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, we know from history that an independent and a vigorous press is a threat to anyone in power, right? Is that the whole point of journalism is to investigate wrongdoing. Now, photojournalism has a slightly different purpose because it also brings this artistic element into it. But I mean, the purpose of journalism is to dig up the bad stuff out there, that powerful people are doing it, to expose it so that civil society, the rest of us, can say, wow, that's not cool. I don't like that. That has to be fixed because we live in a society of accountability, right? That is changing. And so historically, the first people that were targeted as enemies were journalists. One of the first things that the Nazis took from Jewish people were their typewriters. Okay, so writers, photographers, filmmakers, creatives, academics, intellectuals, they are not welcome in any authoritarian society because they ask questions. So this is what we are seeing now with this idea of, first, that the press is the enemy of the people, and second, that there is no truth. That, as Kellyanne Conway said, well, there's an alternate set of facts. Okay. And so, once you say, like Steve Bannon said, let's just like throw shit at everything, then people have no foundation, right? And that's very dangerous because then anything can fill that gap. And what's filling it now, among other things, is this giant QAnon conspiracy. And David knows from being there January 6th, is that there was a big QAnon contingent in January 6th. And this is a completely crazy. Do people know what QAnon is? Hands up. Okay.
Thank you.
Of QAnon? Yeah. So QAnon is a movement that was started by what people think, or this is the idea, started by a man that was operating one of these right-wing message boards. First it was 4chan, now it's 8chan or 8chun. And it's the kind of basis of the movement is that there was a deep state, deep secret state, right? That is controlling everything. And this deep state is protecting pedophiles, sexual perverts, child traffickers, bloodsuckers, okay? Donald Trump is the man that can uncover the deep state and save us from these pedophile, blood-sucking, Satan-worshiping Democrats who are in office and all levels of government looking to steal your children. That is QAnon. Okay. My former Lieutenant General Michael Flynn has taken the QAnon oath, stands with QAnon followers. Okay, so it started small and it is big, and it has been now embraced by the Republican Party. And it is very dangerous because at any moment, if you can get people to believe that, okay, you can get people to believe anything. And that is the power of that kind of propaganda.
I've got a question for you. I don't know how long, Nina, you've been teaching, but
Yeah. All right.
I don't know how long you've been teaching, but I'm wondering what evolution you've seen in students from when you started teaching in terms of people who want to photograph and want to be photojournalists to what you're seeing today and what their motivations are. Has it stayed the same? Has it changed? What are you seeing in terms of the student population?
Yeah, I would say that, and this is a cause of optimism really, is that people, despite the fact that journalists get paid really badly and, you know, no one likes you when you're out there working, people still really want to be journalists, and they still feel very strongly about going out there and the importance of witnessing and of being an informed witnesser, right? Of like observing, witnessing, and trying to tell people stories. If anything, I would say the difference is that they're much more concerned about the rights of the person being photographed, right? Which has become a big part of our class conversations. And I think when I first went to school, wasn't really talked about so much. And I think that's a positive thing.
Right side of things through effective photography, things like that. Are you finding that people who are studying this very technically?
Columbia kind of, you know, draws like kind of a mixed bag. I mean, there's still some people that, you know, go into journalism that they want to cover sports or food, or, you know, they're not that necessarily interested in the whole political social landscape. But I would say that the majority of Columbia students, you know, they want to do big investigative projects and, you know, fight the good fight. We don't get right now, at least in the journalism school, say, I don't know, people looking to perfect their photography to increase the propagandistic elements of it.
I had a question for David. I'm sure I wasn't the only person who was struck by your photograph of the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, that it had a sort of painterly quality, almost like a history painting. I was curious if you were ever having that preoccupation in the work that you did, its relation to history painting, and secondly, whether you had a point of view about the profusion of imagery that we have nowadays as against, you know, trying to memorialize or immemorialize something in paint as was done a long time ago.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's the second question is a really big one. So, you know, I don't think we've got the next 3 hours, but on the first point, I mean, just more generally speaking, I think that in the last several years, I've been more interested in thinking of my work in a historical context. So previously I was just more like in the moment. I just enjoyed the job, you know, and I was just thinking about a picture that would be in a magazine the next week. And that was sort of, and then maybe I started thinking about, oh, well, maybe this could go in a book that'll come out next year, like somebody else's book, some other book or whatever. But now I'm really starting to think about, especially, you know, at this time that we're in right now, which, you know, seems really significant. And, you know, we don't know which direction it's going to go in, but, you know, the work that that people at this time are making is going to be the record of history 100 years from now. So the picture that you're referring to of Jeff Flake, I was just trying to take an interesting picture. I certainly didn't have a Renaissance, you know, idea in my head when I was photographing that. I just knew that it would be cool to see what happened around with the people around Jeff Flake as soon as that hearing was over, and it just worked out. The lighting in that room happens to be really good from certain angles. So, you know, that was in my head a little bit, that sort of classic lighting or whatever. Sorry, what was it? Say again, the nuance of the second part of your question of,
Well, I was really trying to get to, you know, when we're surrounded by, there's this tidal wave of imagery that's around us now. And yeah, I guess, how do you, if you're now thinking in that historical way about your imagery, how do you see that in terms of the context of, you know, where your imagery is going and all that kind of thing?
yeah, I think that, yes, you're absolutely right that we're flooded by all these pictures. So in a way, I think it sort of, it forces people in our profession to up our game. You know, I think Instagram is another example of that. I mean, just the fact that any photographer anywhere can put their stuff up online and it can be seen. You know, when I started out as a magazine photographer, you know, you kind of like had to be on assignment usually for your pictures to get published, or if you were just shooting on spec, you know, maybe you'd get published somewhere and somebody would see it. But now everybody's seeing what everybody's doing. And so, you know, even just from the photographer's perspective, we're seeing, you know, there are more photographers at these events because there's so many different media organizations. It's easier to get the pictures out because you're not shooting film. You don't have that expense of processing and shipping it. And it's just going directly to the viewer. So I think, yes, I think that does make some of us more cognizant of, you know, the importance of trying to make a graphically interesting picture and trying to make pictures that say something beyond just describing what the event is, because anybody can kind of do that with their cell phone. So we have to figure out what our raison d'etre is. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I stole the mic from my husband. I want to thank you both for being here. And I had two comments and then a question, but one, Nina, I loved your provocation about violence being a career maker. I just thought it really stood out to me. And David, the idea of like kind of struggling with tragedy and beauty simultaneously. I just want to share that struck me. I had a question more about, obviously the internet is a big topic of conversation and everything that you're discussing, and it's intangible. So I'm curious, as photographers, how you're trying to grapple with capturing the impact of a screen, how much our lives are lived on a screen, knowing that it is very much in an ether, but driving a lot of our behaviors. So like, how are you grappling with that in terms of visual representation?
Well, for instance, I made a movie about Trump in 2017, but I didn't have any access to him physically. And I realized that it didn't matter because he really exists on the screens. And that's how people relate to him. That's how he communicates. And once I understood that, I started to have a lot more fun making the film. And I also realized that that's what the film was really about, how he manipulates and uses the medium and the technology to communicate with crowds and how the crowds receive that, right? And so it's almost like the picture I showed earlier with the KKK. Obviously you don't see any screens, you don't see any cameras. It is almost impossible now to make a photograph without another camera or a screen in the picture. So I think as photographers, initially we try to, how do I get around these other cameras, right? But now I've just kind of embraced them as part of the landscape. And so they are there. And so I have used them more in my photography, actually used other people's screens, incorporating those into my pictures. That might be a bit more of a specific answer to your question than a philosophical one, but yeah, that's my.
Yeah, and if I could, yeah, that's really interesting because yeah, I've certainly noticed the same thing, and yeah, you kind of have to accept it. And so I think to sort of elaborate on your question a little bit, and also the one from the gentleman before, you know, when I was in Washington, one of the things I was interested in was kind of like, you know, what was going on like outside of the frame of the TV cameras, like what's the stuff that you don't see on TV? And then because I didn't know what that was, because I didn't have any experience working there, but then also including kind of like, you know, with the Uvalde stuff, including the fact that the media, that is part of the story now. You can't subtract that, because that pushes the national dialogue, in that case, on gun control, right? But then the other thing is that, you know, I think it sort of gives us an opportunity in a way to put our photographs or our films into a different place than what just ordinary people are doing with their own cameras and their own Instagram feeds and Facebook and stuff like that, is to think about how these pictures can last and putting them in the kind of forms where they can last. So one of them is by doing a book, right? Which, you know, and then the other is right here. So to me, that's like, this is the best place that these pictures can end up, because they're gonna last. And people, you know, you're not just scrolling through and you're spending 2.5 seconds on the screen looking at it. You're stopping. There's a physicality to it. It's tangible, and someone's gonna keep these, and it's, you know, 100, 200, 500 years from now, people are going to be looking at these exact prints right now. And I don't think you can, you know, there's just too much stuff on the web. It just won't compete. So, yeah.
This gentleman, I think, had a question. Yeah.
It's fine.
Question, but I'll do it. I'll come back to you, Aiden.
I'm really curious about how you handle the frustration, you and your colleagues. You showed some great shots, one or two of January 6th, of the thousands that we have seen now over and over and over again. And yet there is this set of the population subset that continues to deny this thing ever happened. It was a love-in, it was a this, and it was a that. And how do you in your minds keep going? And particularly, what can you as photojournalists do and the media do to finally put an end to this total and complete denial of what everybody has seen? I mean, it's like, how can you deny the war in Ukraine? You see it daily. And yet people go, ah, that's not a war, that's a this, that's a that. So I'm just curious how you deal with that gut-wrenching thing.
It's a great question.
I think we deal with it by showing up and actually continuing to make these pictures. And I just, you know, to think about the title of this exhibition, Imagine a World Without Photojournalism, just think for a moment, if we didn't see any pictures of January 6th, if there were no pictures, none of us would have believed that it happened, you know. And I'm not even talking about the part of the population that either, you know, is knowingly denying it, even though they were even in the room and running for their lives, right? But think about Ukraine. I mean, you had some of the greatest photographers in the world go there and say, I'm going to document this. Can my pictures try and make a difference, at least by showing the rest of the world, wow, this is another awful invasion. And so I don't think much about the population that refuses to believe it. I just think about, what can I do in this moment that I am here to try and make the best photography I possibly can do, so that someone will actually see it and know that it was important that we were there.
So let me take it one step further. I'm in the health. I'm a retired health person. COVID is a good example. We've had really great photojournalism of what's going on throughout the United States and the world in terms of COVID and how we dealt with it. And yet in this state and everywhere else, COVID deniers go up the road here. They won't get vaccinated. They won't be treated. And it spills over on the rest of us. And so again, you guys are doing your job, but somehow or other, it's not getting through. And I just don't know how you deal with that.
Well, I'm not sure if I have anything to say than what you said. I think, you know, at the best we can do, we're just one person. Yeah, I'm one person, you know, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, thanks. It's sort of like, you know, the way I see it, it's sort of like each of us is just one, you know, putting one drop into the bucket of knowledge or reflection or record or whatever you want to call it. And we're trying to do it in a way that's compelling so that as many people will see it as possible. And yeah.
So I have a couple of ideas. You know, in New York City, we had basically a mass casualty event, right? 30,000 people dead in a very short period of time. And it was really scary living there. The city of New York did a beautiful thing where they projected on the Brooklyn Bridge photographs of people who had passed away from COVID. It was one of the most moving public art events I have witnessed. And it went on for over an hour. Gorgeous pictures of people who had lost their lives. And this was something that the city encouraged people to upload pictures and then spent the time projecting them. I think these kinds of public photographic projections can really bring people together in a space that's depoliticized, right? But it kind of requires creativity among all of us to say, hey, how do we reach these other people? How do we, you know, communicate our stories so it's out there, so it's not just in our phones and our little spaces?
Hi, maybe more of a technical question because I'm actually starting the Columbia graduate program next month. I was curious what your respective approaches were to putting yourself in the place that things are happening. Are you just hopping on planes constantly? And then once at those events, how are you thinking about the way that you're going about capturing photos, knowing that we live in an era where everyone's hyper aware that they are being captured? How do you deal with the subjects being aware of your presence? And how do you think about, how much time do you think about composition and the sort of like more artful aspects as opposed to how do I just get the photo and tell the story?
Okay, sure. 1, 2, okay. Yeah, well, a lot of it is practice in a way. I mean, the more you do it, I think the better sense you have of you know, the photographic aspects of it, which is, to me, that part is, it's ongoing. It's not like I feel like I've mastered anything. There's no such thing. It's just like I just try to keep evolving as a photographer and thinking about new ways of seeing light and composing and things like that. And I try to think about ways of, you know, finding maybe a style or drawing on a style that I've used before that will work well for that particular situation. Like it's a good fit. It's a way of seeing or a way of communicating that I think might work. So it's that, and then partly experience and then having it's almost like a pre-visualization, like an athlete before a game or a match or something, of what that, you know, what their opponent's going to be like and what they might be facing. And so that you kind of like, you sort of steel yourself for it a little bit, you know, as in preparing yourself for it. And I mean, my overall strategy is usually, I mean, particularly with the Trump crowd, is just to get out of any conversation as quickly as possible. Just keep moving. It's like, you know, so like Nina was talking about the press pass thing. On January 6th, I had my congressional press pass, and during the Trump rally, I kept that inside my jacket. And then I had this press pass from a Trump rally like the month before. So I had that out. It said like, go for Trump, whatever it said, march for Trump or whatever it was. And so if somebody tried to stop me, engage me, like, hey, what are you doing? I'm like, hey man, and then just keep moving. So it's like that. And then when I got inside the Capitol, I flipped it,
Yeah, I am. So if you dress in black at Trump rallies, they will, bad idea. And photographers actually like to dress like very bland, right? Dark, solid colors. You want to be the person who kind of disappears. You don't wear really flashy clothes. So I decided as a kind of a social experiment that I would go to a Trump rally wearing a red shirt, just like a bright red shirt. And I was perceived very differently. It was really amazing. Nothing was on the shirt. No, I would never put on a Trump shirt. I would never put on anything like that. But just the color red signified, friend. Okay. But at other demonstrations, you kind of start to gauge the sense of like, is the crowd accepting or hostile? I'll make eye contact with people. I'll get a sense if they're going to let me in their space for a while and walk with them if it's a march, right? I have become personally a bit more sensitive to whether someone wants to be photographed. So if someone puts their hand up like no pictures, I'm not the journalist that says, oh, but I have a right. I don't do that, even though I do have a right. I won't, if someone doesn't want to be photographed, I'm not going to argue the First Amendment with them. I'm going to move on to someone else, right? And so, yeah, I think it's just keeping yourself really contained, calm, right? And just sort of following the flow crowd.
Really appreciate your work. Can you, building on that sense of personal safety, I know you want to get the shot and be in there, and some of these frankly look incredibly scary to be in there. Can you talk about how you think about your personal sense of safety versus getting the shot? And, are there times where you're like, no, I just need to pull back? And I'm kind of thinking the NPR or the PBS correspondents where they were finally like, we need to pull back from this. We can't be in there.
January 6th, I was working alone, and I think that was a mistake. And at some point during the day, I felt unsafe and I left. So I think I really made a big mistake by working alone. And you saw most photographers either like with friends, and I should have done that, but I didn't.
That can help, having somebody to just, sort of help look out for you. I think Nina's point about how you dress, that I didn't know that story about the red shirt. That's really interesting. On January 6th, I grew up in Texas. I know a little bit about like how some of these people dress. So I had like a khakis Levi jacket on, and I was pretty blendy with that crowd. I was also wearing a gas mask for most of the time. So that doesn't facilitate conversation or confrontation really. So that helps. But yeah, there's lots of times I've pulled back. I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get killed, for a picture. So I think you just kind of like what Nina was saying about gauging the tone of the crowd, and that goes for a demonstration, or it goes for anything else where maybe you're around violence. Is you have to, you're trying to read just the mood as best as you can and figure out how what you can do and maybe what's a little bit too risky.
Yeah, I feel that photojournalism should always have more than just the capture of a moment in time. In back of, I would hope, a photojournalist's mind is to change the course of something that's happening by portraying what has happened, and hopefully changing the course of history in the future with respect to that kind of event. And I'm thinking specifically of
combat and war, Ukraine. That the greatest danger in photojournalism is the sanitization of that photography. In order to be published, to some degree, you have to sanitize it, or the publisher, or somebody has to get in there and take out the shock of that photography. I think of two particular photographs that have achieved that change. One is Emmett Till. The second is, I think, the photograph of the Spanish loyalists. I think that was a Capra photograph of coming forward and being shot. Most powerful photograph I think I've ever seen, along with the Emmett Till photograph. But that kind of openness is so lacking in a lot of photography, photojournalism today. I mean, you actually spoke a little bit
Do you have a
about it earlier.
question? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the question is. Do you feel it's like the photojournalism is too sanitized?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? So I think like David was mentioning it a little bit with the Uvalde
Yes.
pictures is, there's certain things that we've decided as a culture we don't want to see, right? And it shouldn't be published. And I'm not sure, like I can understand the debates on both sides of that. I'm not absolutely certain where I stand yet on it, but there is something about for a culture as ours so steeped in violence, and we really are a culture steeped in violence. We're really uptight about showing violence. And so is there some kind of correlation there? I don't know, but I also know that seeing too many violent images can have a dehumanizing, numbing effect. So I'm not sure the answer, what the answer is. I feel like we need a little bit more research on that.
I think tying in with sort of the theme, if I may, I don't know that the photojournalists are sanitizing images. It has to go through a photo editor, and that there was a big decision at the beginning of the Ukraine war where the Times published Lindsay Adario's photograph, which there was a lot of pro and con about that. So I just think that that's something that should be, the photojournalist may be doing the work, but it may not get published.
That's very true, Sid.
Yeah, and we're going to just have time for a couple more questions. I think you were next, and then we have a question from Zoom, and then we'll get the last.
Thank you. All right, hello. I'm dressed like a photographer. Well, I don't know if you can see that. All right, but my question goes back to the topic of new technologies and tools and challenges that they've presented. How has the injection of high resolution cameras such as like iPhones and extremely portable pocket cameras and things like that impacted your work? For example, January 6th, I mean, during prosecution and finding people who to prosecute, they used a lot of cell phone footage, and there were a lot of pictures taken and on cell phones, and people sort of incriminated themselves because they were live streaming or whatever, but like they used it on the news and things like that. So yeah.
So is your question like, so on January 6th, because people were not just photographing their own crimes, but also tweeting about their own crimes, how does that impact our work? Well, I think makes people more suspicious of us because they're afraid, wow, you're taking my picture, but I'm doing something bad. So, your pictures could be used against me. And so I think it's a weird dynamic, I have to say, because on the one hand, like they're photographing themselves engaged in committing crimes, but yet they're worried about other people photographing that. So there's some sort of cognizant dissonance there. But I think it just adds to the general nature of suspicion of journalists and of cameras and what's your purpose? What are you going to do with those pictures? Who are you? You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll add that, you know, a lot of this in recent events, this sort of the Trump stuff, January 6th, the George Floyd protests in 2020, that happened in the middle of COVID. So everybody was wearing masks anyway. And I'm wondering if that's just going to be more of a common trend that we see people out protesting, whether or not they're really doing anything, whether or not they're breaking any laws. But I'm expecting that that's just going to be a little bit more common just in general. So, and I think just, I mean, the fact that the FBI now has, you know, is charging a lot of these January 6 people. I mean, I think especially with that crowd, it's going to make them much more aware. I don't think prior to that, they may not have been necessarily so sensitive because they thought the police were on their side. And they thought, you know, just right. But now I think they probably have a different attitude about it.
It's interesting. There's a women's reproductive clinic in downtown Manhattan, and once a month, a very militant Catholic anti-abortion organization descends upon that clinic, and hundreds of pro-choice people show up to try and stop them from getting to the clinic. And the pro-choice activists are instructed to wear masks, right? So even though it's outdoors, even though it may not be a high COVID risk at the moment, they're wearing masks so that the anti-choice groups and the police do not identify them. Which for us makes it really hard, because how do you get emotion in people's faces? How do you see people's faces, right? Their masks, their mouths, right? Yeah. So it's changed photography.
I think we're going to wrap it up there. We'd like to invite everybody to stay and maybe talk privately with Nina and David. We do have a few copies of their books if you'd like to take a look and possibly have them sign it for you. But I can't thank our guests enough for coming, and especially Nina and David. Just very, very quickly, it is people like Nina and David that have been our inspiration to do what we do. So it's really an honor to have them here.
I really don't have more to add, but you are, and I know you don't want to hear this, heroic. And you're serving your country and you're serving history. And I don't know where we're going, but I know that good people like you will be there.